You'd think that a morning in ancient Rome, heading out for a day of public entertainment, would be all sandals and sunshine. But I'm your bedtime historian, and today you're squeezing into a marble stadium where the seating arrangements could reveal your entire social status right before you faint from sunstroke. The air smells like dust oil and anticipation. Feet shuffle against stone vendors, cry out for your attention, and somewhere a lion growls. Why did thousands of Romans willingly gather to endure discomfort, danger, and social scrutiny just for a glimpse of men fighting to the death? And why even today do historians still argue whether the earliest games were truly free to all or just another illusion served to the plebs? If you enjoy finding out that even ancient spectators risked more than just boredom, maybe tap, like, and subscribe. It won't get you better seating, but it might keep this voice rambling longer. What time is it for you? And which historical spot would you brave the crowd to see, even if the snacks were overpriced? Now dim, the lights maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice is the sound. It rolls over you like a wave. Footsteps on worn stone hawkers selling flatbread and honeyed nuts, children whining about blisters. Somewhere behind you, someone drops a ceramic jug. It shatters. No one looks. This is the morning rush into the Colosseum, the Flavian Amphitheater, if you want to sound like a senator. You're one of 50,000 Romans making your way inside elbow to elbow with strangers who smell like garlic sweat and civic duty. The games won't start for hours, but you came early. Everyone did. Because where you sit says who you are, and moving up in life sometimes means bribing a guard or faking a toga with thicker stripes. You pass under stone arches called vomitoria, not because anyone's puking yet, but because they spew people into the stands with architectural efficiency. The seating is steep and strictly tiered: senators in front, nobles next, then citizens, foreigners, women, and slaves at the top. If you're wealthy, you're sitting on marble. If not, it's stone or worse, a plank bench with nails that occasionally rust through your tunic. Shade. Only the rich get awnings. Everyone else gets the sun in their eyes, and the smell of roasting animal fat drifting up from the arena, and the view. It's not always worth it. Some spectators arrive hours early just to claim a better angle. A few bring periscopic mirrors or, more daringly, try to switch seat markers in the dark. It's all part of the game before the games. Scholars still debate whether these early spectacles were truly open to the public in the modern democratic sense. Some argue they were strategic distractions, a way for emperors to feed and entertain the masses just enough to prevent revolt. Others believe certain tickets cost more than most citizens made in a month, making free feel rather conditional. Still, as the day unfolds and the crowd thickens, you feel the buzz of anticipation, the knowledge that you're about to witness something rare, chaotic, and oddly communal. You shift on your bench trying to get comfortable and tell yourself it's worth it. After all, you got in. Just when you think the danger's confined to the arena, something rustles beneath your feet, a whisper of instability, a snap of tension in the wooden plank below. The crowd is rowdy, but oblivious, swept up in anticipation. And yet beneath the surface, something's off, something unsafe. The Colosseum is famed for its spectacles, but it's less known for the sheer volume of accidents that befell its audience. While most eyes were fixed on gladiators and wild beasts, few noticed the quieter casualties: people fainting, falling, or worse. You find yourself among them now, scanning for a stable place to stand as the crowd surges forward. The architecture may be grand, but the safety protocols, let's just say OSHA would have wept. Take the seating itself. While the lower tiers were carved from solid stone, many of the upper rows were constructed with wood, hastily, cheaply, and often overcrowded. You can almost hear the creaking now, a moan of pressure above your head. Spectators packed in so tightly elbows dug into ribs, knees against backs, and children perched dangerously on ledges just for a glimpse. Collapses weren't common, but they weren't rare either. One historian even noted that parts of the structure seemed to shift during larger events, like a living thing trying to breathe under pressure. Then there's the matter of wild animals. The Roman bestiarii, the beast handlers, were trained, sure, but not infallible. On more than one occasion, lions leapt over their enclosures, cheetahs darted through the crowd, and bears tore through wooden barriers like they were parchment. If you were seated in the lower rows, that thrill of being close to the action, it came with the risk of being part of it. The layout didn't help. With exits poorly spaced and corridors jammed, full panicked crowds had no safe way out. Stampedes occurred when animals escaped when fire broke out, or simply when someone screamed loud enough to start a chain reaction. The stairs steep narrow, and worn turned into chutes of chaos. Falling could mean being trampled. Being slow could mean being crushed. And water. That's a luxury, not a given. On hot days, people fainted from sunstroke, their bodies dragged out by friends, or left to recover in the aisles. Vendors sold watered wine, but some added vinegar herbs, or even narcotics to boost profits or to keep people docile. It worked sometimes too well. There are tales of spectators who didn't wake up. Despite the dangers, the empire made only modest efforts to improve safety. Engineering priorities focused more on spectacle than stability. Stone lions' heads for drainage trap doors, for surprise tiger appearances, and elaborate pulley systems, none of it built with spectator well-being in mind. Modern scholars still puzzle over the lack of documented reforms. Did the emperors simply not care? Or did the people addicted to blood sport and communal experience accept the risk as part of the thrill? No consensus exists. But as you sit there sweating wedged between a snoring merchant and a goatish teenager with olives on his breath, you realize watching isn't always safer than fighting. The hum of the crowd is replaced by silence, then screaming. Above you, the world shifts. A creak becomes a crack, and suddenly the upper tier collapses like a broken jaw would, and bodies tumbling in a sickening cascade. There's no warning, just chaos. One of the most tragic and strangely overlooked disasters in Roman entertainment history was a balcony collapse that claimed hundreds of lives. The incident occurred not in the Colosseum itself, but in a nearby amphitheater in Fidene just outside of Rome. Built hastily by a private entrepreneur, eager to impress the venue, lacked proper foundations. The upper seating made of cheap timber and supported by nothing sturdier than hope and greed gave way mid-performance. The crash was deafening. The screams unforgettable. Though this particular collapse happened outside Rome, its shock rippled across the empire, casting a spotlight on the structural risks of all public venues, especially the Colosseum. And yet, remarkably little changed. Despite the loss of life, estimated at over 20,000 by some ancient accounts, though modern historians suspect far fewer, the games continued. There were condolences, there were promises, but the next event sold out just the same. In the Colosseum, wood was often used to extend seating capacity, especially for festivals or imperial birthdays. Upper decks were patched and layered with temporary platforms, each more rickety than the last. Some seats leaned against scaffolding, anchored in sand. The weight of anticipation was literal. You imagine standing there in one of those upper rows staring down at the sand-dusted floor of the arena. Suddenly your bench groans. There's a shiver beneath your feet. The person next to you gasps, and you realize they're not looking at the lions. They're looking at the beam above your head. Even after the Fidene tragedy record suggests that event organizers under pressure to maintain spectacle often ignored building codes or whatever passed for them. After all, the audience was replaceable. But Delaying an emperor's festival, that was dangerous. Some scholars argue that casualty numbers from collapses were deliberately underreported. Roman record keepers, often under the thumb of the state, knew better than to embarrass a powerful patron. Others suggest that so many attendees were from the lower classes, laborers, freedmen, slaves, that their deaths were seen as a tragic but acceptable cost. Still, not everyone looked away. Satirists and poets of the time made veiled references to wooden tombs and clapping boards, mocking the careless construction and the public's willingness to risk it all for a brief view of the blood below. Their words, preserved in dusty scrolls, remain among the few honest accounts of the incident's horror. You glance upward now, hyper-aware of every groan in the wood above you. The thrill of being high enough to see the whole arena suddenly feels less rewarding. The Colosseum may be a marvel, but here in the cheap seats, the only thing thinner than the planks beneath you is the line between watching and falling. The air smells strange today, drier, heavier, tinged with something almost metallic. As you shuffle into your usual spot in the upper tiers, you catch a shimmer in the sunlight, a fine gray dust floating lazily over the arena. It settles in your nostrils, on your tongue like ash. Decades after Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii in volcanic fire, Rome carried on with its daily rhythm. But evidence suggests the effects of that eruption lingered, reaching even into the Colosseum itself. Historians have long debated whether particles from Vesuvius continued to waft across central Italy long after the blast, and more intriguingly, whether those fine traces of ash impacted the breathing space inside Rome's most famous amphitheater. The design of the Colosseum, grand arches, soaring tiers, and partial awnings, was a marvel for acoustics and spectacle, but ventilation less so. The bowl-like shape could trap heat smoke and airborne particles. Combine that with the thousands of torches, sweaty bodies, and open pits used for animal storage below, and you had yourself a haze thick enough to chew. You sit in the upper rows now, blinking at the faint fog dancing over the arena floor. It clings to the air between events when the crowd stills and the scent of singed flesh or spilled oil wafts up. Some days it's worse than others when the wind shifts or when the sky refuses to clear. Your neighbor coughs into his sleeve and mutters something about mountain ghosts. Archaeologists have found ash layers in parts of Rome dating years after the eruption. While some dismiss them as ordinary urban dust, others suggest a broader dispersal of volcanic particles slowly drifting inland and mingling with city soot. If true, this means Roman lungs may have been quietly inhaling Vesuvius for decades, especially in places like the Colosseum, where crowds and containment magnified every breath. There's no scholarly agreement on whether this ash was dangerous in the long term. Some point to chronic coughs and eye irritations noted in Roman medical texts. Others insist those were just the effects of bad wine and worse plumbing. Still, it's hard to ignore the gritty texture coating your teeth after a day in the stands. And yet, the games went on. No matter the haze, no matter the coughing fits or watery eyes. The people came for blood and bread, not clean air. The idea of closing the Colosseum for air quality would have been laughable, even insulting. That was a problem for the sick, the old, or the weak-hearted. You squint across the rows watching the misty glow settle along the uppermost benches. The sunlight filtering through the awning makes the dust sparkle almost beautifully. But behind the shimmer is discomfort, a scratchy reminder that even the sky in ancient Rome had teeth. As you adjust your tunic and cough into your sleeve, you wonder not for the first time how much of the spectacle you're breathing in. There's no breeze today, just heat, relentless glinting off stone and sand like a cruel joke. The crowd shifts like a restless ocean, fans flapping damp cloths pressed to brows and murmurs rising about the sun's fury. Welcome to a typical summer afternoon in the Colosseum. where sunstroke wasn't a risk, it was a rite of passage. Rome's Mediterranean summers were scorching, and the Colosseum, for all its engineering brilliance, offered little respite. The Valerium, a massive fabric awning, could provide shade for some, but it didn't cover the entire arena. And guess who got the shaded seats? Not you. That privilege belonged to senators, priests, and honored guests lounging in the lower tiers. Everyone else packed into the upper rows, baked like bread in a clay oven. You can feel it now. The sweat pooling behind your knees, the grit collecting along your collar, the sting in your eyes from sun and dust. Water sellers roam the aisles with ceramic jugs, but their prices rise with the heat. Some spectators sip watered wine or chew mint leaves to cool their mouths. Others bring small pieces of soaked linen to drape over their heads, praying it stays damp longer than a lion's patience. And then there are the sandstorms. Not always, but often enough to dread. A dry gust would sweep through the arena, whipping up fine particles of dust and powdered limestone. It stung the eye's coated food and turned every shout into a mouthful of grit. You'd blink rapidly trying to see the fighters below and end up watching shadows in a cloud. Fashion tried to help wide-brimmed hats, light linen tunics, and sandals with extra thick soles, but the Roman answer to heat was usually endurance. Fainting wasn't uncommon, neither was vomiting dizziness or the occasional hallucination. You remember once seeing a man strip down to his undergarments and lie flat on the stairs, claiming the gods told him the stones were cool. They weren't. Some historians argue the heat was part of the draw, a shared test of will, a badge of Roman grit. Others suggest it kept the crowds docile, sluggish enough to avoid riots, but still present enough to cheer. No agreement exists. What is certain is that spectators endured conditions that would have emptied a modern stadium within minutes. You look around now and see a child nodding off on his father's lap, his cheeks flush pink. A woman next to you fans herself with a piece of broken amphora, eyes half closed. The man behind you snores lightly, his forehead shining. Everyone is tired. Everyone is waiting. The sun won't set for hours, but still they sit, willing to be scorched and smothered, just to witness a moment of spectacle. As your tunic clings to your back and the dust settles between your teeth, you realize this isn't just a crowd. It's a ritual. A slow-roasting congregation bound by sweat, sun, and the strange satisfaction of suffering together for the sake of entertainment. The roar you hear is not from the crowd. It's deeper, more primal, a sound that rumbles through your chest before your brain has time to explain it. Something is loose. Animals were supposed to stay in the arena. That was the design. That was the plan. But plans in the Colosseum, like bones, could break. Roman spectacles loved to flirt with chaos, and sometimes chaos flirted back with claws and fangs. You're leaning forward, craning your neck for a better view when it happens. A lion, clearly agitated, bolts toward the barrier. It doesn't slow. The wooden partition meant to protect the front row's splinters under its weight. Screams ripple through the audience like thrown stones in a pond. You don't even see where it goes, just the blur of fur and the sound of sandals slapping stone as people scramble. Animal escapes were rare, but far from unheard of. Cheetahs, panthers, even elephants were part of Rome's blood theater. The Colosseum's basement, the hypogum, was a warren of cages, pulleys, and trapdoors, designed to deliver beasts onto the stage in dramatic fashion. But every now and then, the drama didn't stop at the arena's edge. Some scholars believe certain escapes were intentional. A sudden burst of danger kept the audience engaged and reminded them that Rome's power extended even to nature. Others argue the escapes were blunders, the result of tired handlers, broken gates, or poorly trained animals. There's no clear answer, only stories. Ancient writers often minimize these incidents, perhaps fearing censorship, or just wishing to preserve the illusion of control. But archaeologists have found claw marks high up in the stone walls too far for any trained display. Graffiti shows crude sketches of spectators running, arms flailing, chased by creatures that shouldn't have been anywhere near them. You picture it now, a leopard prowling through the aisles, children shrieking, a nobleman dropping his goblet as he clambers over benches. A gladiator off-duty and half-dressed rushing up the stairs with a spear to protect his own family. Chaos with a furry face. After an escape, cleanup was swift. Injuries downplayed, damage repaired. By the next day, the crowd would return curiosity unshaken. You find yourself wondering, what would you do if a bear came charging through your section? Right now, would you run freeze? Offer it your neighbor's salted fish cakes. Some accounts suggest that crowd behavior during escapes became almost ritualized. Screams then, a surge of movement followed by awkward laughter when things calmed, as if fear itself had become part of the entertainment. A brief, sharp reminder that death wasn't just a performance on the sand below, it could sit beside you panting. The show eventually resumes, but the audience remains jittery. Even now, the air feels tight. You glance toward the nearest exit, counting how many people you'd have to shove past, just in case. The Colosseum may have been built for glory, but it always had room for a little accidental terror. Someone sitting in your seat, again. You stand there halfway up the tiered steps, sweating and annoyed, clutching your small bundle of olives and honeyed nuts. The seat marker, a scratched-in numeral on the stone bench, clearly matches the wax tablet you brought. But the man already seated there. He just shrugs and pretends not to notice. Welcome to the unspoken battlefield of Colosseum seating. Not all dangers in the arena came with teeth. Some wore tunics, smiled politely, and had no intention of giving up a better view. Seating in the Colosseum was more than just a comfort. It was a public declaration of status, identity, and access. And if you thought gladiators were ruthless, you haven't seen what an ambitious Roman would do for a front row seat. In theory, seating was assigned by social class. Senators up front, equites or the knightly class just behind. Free male citizens next then, foreigners and freedmen. Women slaves and the very poor filled the top rows. But theory is neat. Reality is not. Guards were supposed to enforce the hierarchy, but bribery often spoke louder than wax seals. A well-placed coin could get you into a better tier or keep someone else out. And if all else failed, there were sneakier methods. Swapping wax tickets, forging seat assignments, even arriving early, and pretending to be asleep when the rightful owner showed up. That last one, surprisingly effective. Graffiti inside the Colosseum and in nearby bathhouses documents just how often seat sneaking occurred. Lucius the liar sits like a senator, smells like a mule, reads one scratch remark. Another, Felix bribed a guard with figs and now calls himself noble. It wasn't just a modern annoyance, it was a known and mocked part of the Roman experience. Some historians believe that the constant jostling for position reflected a deeper social anxiety. In a city obsessed with rank, where your toga's stripe width could determine your future, even a 2-foot shift forward in the stands felt like a triumph. Others argue it was just practical. The best views came with better shade, easier vendor access, and fewer flying splinters. Still, not everyone got away with it. Some seat jumpers were dragged out by guards, publicly shamed or fined. One story tells of a man who impersonated a senator to sit in the front row and was pelted with fruit by the real senators when caught. But these incidents didn't deter future schemers. If anything, they made the game more elaborate. As you finally persuade the interloper to scoot aside, you settle onto the warm stone and glance toward the arena. A lion is licking its paw. A gladiator adjusts his helmet. But here in the cheap seats, the drama has already begun. Because in the Colosseum, danger didn't just happen in the sand, it happened in the politics of where you sat, who saw you there, and how far you'd go to move one row closer to the gods. You overhear someone behind you say, "Don't eat too much, you'll need the vomitorium." Another chuckles knowingly. You roll your eyes, because no, that's not what it means. Not even close. Few ancient misunderstandings have stuck as stubbornly as the myth of the Roman vomitorium. Say the word today, and most people imagine an elite dining chamber where senators stuff themselves with dormice and honey-roasted songbirds, then ducked out for a good ceremonial purge just to make room for dessert. Enter the next round of oysters. But that's not how it worked. Not at all. The word vomitorium refers to an architectural feature, not a bodily function. Specifically, it means the passageways in stadiums and theaters designed to spew crowds in and out efficiently, like arteries. You walk through a vomitorium on your way into the Colosseum today, whether you realized it or not. It didn't involve any olives coming back up. Roman engineers loved efficiency. The vomitoria allowed tens of thousands to enter or exit the amphitheater within minutes, a marvel of logistics that modern sports arenas still envy. Their name came from the Latin root vomere, meaning to discharge, and had nothing to do with digestion. So, how did the myth start? Some scholars trace the confusion to Renaissance or Victorian writers who romanticized and exaggerated Roman decadence. There were, after all, wild parties. There were banquets where the food never stopped, and guests reclined on cushions while slaves massaged their feet. But even in the most indulgent accounts, vomiting was a private matter rarely ritualized, and certainly not architectural. Despite endless corrections, the myth refuses to die. It shows up in travel blogs, TV comedies, even classroom discussions. One theory is that people just like believing the worst about Rome. It makes our own messy habits seem tame by comparison. Others suggest that vomitorium simply sounds too deliciously absurd to let go of. You lean back and watch the latest wave of spectators pour through the arched tunnels. One child is crying. A man yells about his sandals. An old woman drops her fig cakes. It's chaotic, but smooth. This is what a vomitorium was built for: movement, flow, exit, and entry in neatly channeled chaos. No food involved, no napkins needed. The misunderstanding may seem harmless, even amusing, but it reveals how easily modern minds project fantasy onto the past. One mistranslation, one juicy anecdote, and centuries of urban design become the punchline of a gluttonous joke. Still, part of you finds the whole thing a little charming. History isn't just about facts, it's also about the stories we attach to them. And sometimes those stories are wildly, hilariously wrong. So, next time you hear someone whisper about senators purging between courses, you can smile knowingly. You've sat in the real vomitorium. It wasn't slippery, it wasn't smelly, it was just a very efficient hallway filled with tired feet and flapping togas. You catch the scent before you see them roasting nut-spiced wine, maybe even grilled dormouse if someone's feeling bold. The arena might be Rome's grand stage of blood and spectacle, but in the stands, it's a street market with a front row view. While gladiators fought below, vendors prowled above. They carried baskets of dates, trays of sausages, vats of lentil stew balanced on crude braziers. You could buy honeyed cakes, lukewarm wine, or cheap trinkets that claimed to bring luck in love or gambling. If it could be shouted and sold, it made its way to the stands. But with commerce came chaos. Aisles clogged with children, begging for sweets, jugglers dropping flaming sticks, and roaming musicians testing the limits of Roman patience. You try to focus on the games, but there's a man beside you loudly haggling over a skewer of roasted sparrow. Someone spills wine behind you. A shriek part, laughter part, protest, as someone steps on a fresh fig tart. Some scholars believe these vendors were officially sanctioned, part of the empire's attempt to placate the crowd and monetize every inch of the event. Others argue they were tolerated nuisances, unlicensed hawkers, sneaking past distracted guards and bribing their way into the action. There are no definitive edicts, just scattered reports, and more than a few comic poems complaining about the sausage man's elbow in my soup. Accidents were common. A dropped oil lamp could start a fire. A spilled drink might send a spectator tumbling down a steep incline. One report mentions a jug of hot lentils overturning into a noblewoman's lap, though the author is suspiciously vague about the outcome. Did she scream? Did someone get stabbed? Or was it all forgotten once the next lion appeared? Petty theft thrived amid the confusion. Vendors weren't just sellers, they were often pickpockets. You'd pay 5 denarii for almonds, then notice your coin pouch was mysteriously lighter. Was it the vendor, the juggler, or the innocent-looking child playing with your sandal ties? You'd never know, and yet people loved it. The chaos, the smells, the convenience of buying food without leaving your seat. Some even came for the market more than the show. He ate 3 ducks and saw no blood jokes, one epigram about a man too distracted by dinner to notice the games at all. You glance down now and see a vendor arguing with a seated woman over a pile of crushed dates. Her toddler is licking stone. Behind them, someone drops a jug and the sharp scent of vinegar spreads. The crowd doesn't flinch. This is just part of the experience commerce as choreography meals served with a side of menace. No one seems bothered. No one expects order. Because in the Roman Colosseum, the boundary between entertainment business and bedlam was always blurry. And if you got scalded by soup on your way to cheer a beheading, well, that's what tunics are for. There's a sudden shift in the crowd. Not a scream, but that uneasy rustle like 1,000 people realizing something all at once. A hand reaches to check a coin purse. Another clutches their cloak tighter. A ripple of suspicion moves across the tiers. Someone's been robbed. The Colosseum wasn't just a marvel of engineering and violence, it was a paradise for pickpockets. With tens of thousands packed shoulder to shoulder, distracted by tigers and swordplay, the opportunities were endless. You came for a spectacle, but you might leave a few rings lighter. Thieves here didn't need darkness. They needed noise. They needed chaos. They needed the perfect distraction, like, say, a gladiator losing his head or a bear climbing a wall. In those moments, fingers worked fast. Pouches sliced, brooches unpinned, belt knots loosened. Most victims didn't notice until much later, if ever. Roman writers mention this problem with grudging admiration. One satirist joked that Rome's fastest runners were not athletes, but those whose fingers itched at the scent of bronze. Another claimed that any man sitting in the top rows without losing a button was either broke or invisible. You glance down at your own pouch tucked under your tunic and tied with an extra knot today. The man beside you hasn't noticed the small hand sneaking under his cloak. A moment later, the thief no older than 16 melts into the crowd, face-blank movements practiced. He disappears behind a woman hawking olives. There was no formal police inside the Colosseum. Some guards patrolled the entrances, more focused on ticketing and bribery than actual security. Once inside, you were mostly on your own. If you caught a thief, you could shout for help, but good luck finding someone who cared enough to intervene. And if the thief ran, well, you'd better be fast and willing to risk missing the next chariot race. Some scholars argue that the thefts were tolerated, maybe even expected, a kind of social tax on distraction. Others believe authorities cracked down hard when the thefts reached the elite, but turned a blind eye when it was just commoners losing pocket change. There's no clear record, only layers of complaint carved into stone and scratched onto tablets. You hear a yelp behind you. A man has just realized his ring is gone. He spins, shouting, accusing everyone and no one. A few spectators roll their eyes. One woman smirks. Another shrugs and whispers, Lucky it wasn't his toga. There were stories, too, of vigilante justice. Thieves caught in the act might be dragged down the steps and tossed into the lower arena, not for trial, but for entertainment. Though whether this happened often or only, in moralizing tales, remains uncertain. Still you stay alert, eyes sharp. Eyes, hand on your pouch, because even here in the midst of Roman grandeur, you're reminded that not all threats wear claws or swords. Some wear sandals and smile too easily. And the Colosseum, for all its grandeur, was never truly safe, especially if you blinked. There's a seat in your row no one wants, not because it's cracked or far from the vendors, but because it's cursed, so they say. Row 13, seat 4. People avoid it, cross themselves near it, or leave offerings on it, a fig a coin, a muttered prayer. Superstition ran deep in ancient Rome, and nowhere did it grow wilder than among the crowds of the Colosseum. While the games promised blood and bravery, the stands offered something spookier, legends whispered from seat to seat, warnings passed down with a wink or a shiver. Row 13 was one of those tales. Was there even a row-numbered 13? Some historians doubt it. Roman numerals don't lend themselves easily to such fears. But the reputation existed. Seat 4, they say, saw more than its fair share of tragedy. A merchant who sat there and died mid-show. A woman struck by falling debris. A boy who vanished during intermission, never seen again. Real events, embellishments. It hardly matters. The legend took root. You glance at the seat now. Empty again, though every other spot is full. Even the goat next to you. Yes, someone brought a goat avoids it. The man in the next seat has one buttock on the cursed spot, but keeps shifting as if sitting too long might summon something. Romans were deeply spiritual, but also deeply practical. Superstitions were their way of hedging bets just in case Jupiter was watching. Omens mattered. Augurs read birds. Priests interpreted entrails. And the idea that one unlucky seat could spell doom, that felt entirely plausible, especially in a place already soaked with death. Some scholars suggest that tales like Row 13's curse were invented by vendors or spectators as crowd control, keep a seat open, create breathing room, or manipulate rivals. Others believe the legends arose naturally born of coincidence and repeated often enough to feel true. There's no definitive proof, just layers of whispers. The Colosseum had other cursed spots too. Columns where people claimed to see ghostly gladiators. A staircase where 3 different spectators tripped and broke arms on the same day. A section of the upper tiers where birds refused to land. These stories weren't official, but they spread fast like spilled wine down stone steps. You remember hearing an old man mutter that seat 4 smelled of ash. Another claimed to have seen a shadow sit there once, no body, just a dent in the cushion. Others left offerings herbs, coins, even strands of hair, as if bargaining with whatever force lingered in the stone. You won't sit there. You don't believe the stories, but still, why risk it? Superstition isn't about belief. It's about patterns, comfort, control. In a world where lions can leap barriers and balconies collapse, a cursed seat almost feels like the least of your worries. Almost. So, you glance again. Still empty. Still waiting. Maybe cursed. Maybe just unloved. But you tighten your tunic all the same, scoot slightly away, and pretend it's just superstition. Because in the Colosseum, some fears weren't found in the arena they sat beside you. You hear crying, not loud, not panicked, just a small, steady sobbing, lost beneath the usual buzz of vendors and chatter. You turn and spot the source, a child, no more than 6 alone, and dusty his tunic, askew, eyes wide and searching. No parent in sight. The Colosseum wasn't built for children. And yet they came carried on shoulders, dragged by tired mothers, perched beside distracted fathers. In a place designed for spectacle and savagery, Children often became invisible even when they wandered off. You imagine being that child now tiny among stone giants, the crowd towering around you like a living wall. You try to retrace your steps, but every arch looks the same. Every face is unfamiliar. The arena below might as well be another world. There were no lost and found booths, no announcements, no guards helping children reunite with parents. If a child wandered off, it became a game of luck. Sometimes a neighbor would take notice and help. Other times they wouldn't, or couldn't. Inscriptions found near the Colosseum hint at these tragedies. Scratched into walls and stairs are names Lucia, Tiberius, Cassia, with crude pleas for return. Some included descriptions or ages, others simply prayed to the gods to bring them back. No records confirm how many of these children were ever found. Historians disagree about the empire's attitude toward lost children in public venues. Some argue that Romans, especially the lower classes, accepted childhood accidents as part of life's unpredictability. Others believe families took elaborate precautions, marking children's hands with ink, assigning older siblings as watchers, or tying cords around wrists. There's no consensus, only the echo of small feet lost in big spaces. One tale tells of a boy who wandered into the hippodrome, the underground labyrinth beneath the arena, and was found days later, dazed and dehydrated after sleeping beside a chained panther. Another speaks of a girl mistaken for a vendor's assistant, pressed into carrying wine trays for hours until someone realized she didn't know the difference between figs and dates. You watch the sobbing child now, still calling out, voice cracking with hope. Someone finally scoops him up, a woman, not his mother, but kind enough to ask questions. He clings to her, a tiny fist wrapped around her tunic. There's a strange silence that follows. Not in the arena, it still echoes with noise, but inside you. A heaviness, a realization that the Colosseum's cruelty didn't always require claws or swords. Sometimes it was just the careless indifference of a distracted crowd. You shift uncomfortably, imagining the small hand that could so easily slip from yours. And you wonder how many stories went untold, how many quiet disappearances were swallowed by the roar of the games. So, next time you imagine Roman children at play, picture this instead: a single sandal dropped on stone steps, a sticky fig abandoned mid-bite, and a child's voice calling for someone who never heard them. Nature calls, but the Colosseum doesn't exactly answer. You glance around scanning for some sign, some symbol, some whispered direction to relief. But there is none. Your options, unclear. Your urgency, increasing. And suddenly the marvels of Roman engineering seem far less impressive. For all its grand columns and clever trapdoors, the Colosseum was notoriously vague about one thing: bathrooms. With tens of thousands in attendance, you'd expect a clear system for sanitation. Yet, historians still debate whether any latrines existed within the amphitheater itself, or whether spectators were left to improvise. If there were internal restrooms, they left little trace. No visible signs, no preserved stalls, no marble plaques thanking the gods for smooth movements. Most theories suggest that visitors had to exit and use nearby public latrines. Communal facilities, often open air, where stone benches with keyhole seats offered limited privacy and even less hygiene. Now, imagine it needing to leave during a chariot race, battling against a surge of bodies moving the other way. Navigating vomitoria, packed with vendors and panicked goats. Slipping past guards who might not let you back in. All for the privilege of relieving yourself in a stone trench with strangers humming beside you. Or, worse, missing the action altogether. You begin to understand why many spectators chose another path: discretion in the shadows. Accounts suggest that corners of the upper tiers became unofficial restrooms during long events. Cloaks were draped for modesty. Some used chamber pots brought from home. Others didn't. The smell by mid-afternoon could rival the beasts in the arena. Archaeological finds hint at this too. Amphora fragments stained with organic residue floor drains placed suspiciously in certain corners, and ancient graffiti complaining about liquid curses from above. One poor soul described a seat ruined by what he politely called the kindness of impatience. Assault was another risk. Public latrines, whether inside or nearby, were hot spots for petty crime and more sinister encounters. The lack of lighting, crowding, and general chaos made them dangerous. Some wealthier citizens brought bodyguards just for a quick dash to the loo. Scholars argue whether the design was a flaw of planning or simply a reflection of Roman attitudes toward bodily functions. Some say modesty wasn't a concern Romans bathed communally after all. Others counter that the Colosseum prioritized spectacle over comfort, assuming you'd either hold it or deal with the consequences. And deal with it they did. You shift in your seat, sympathetic to the thousands who came before you. Bladders, clenched eyes watering, hoping the next intermission would bring relief. Maybe the emperor's speech would run long. Maybe there'd be a pause for lion cleanup. Maybe a chance to run. But until then, you sit very still, pretending that nothing's wrong. Because in the Colosseum, you don't just endure heat dust and stampedes. You endure the quiet desperation of a bathroom break deferred, and the lurking dread of not finding your way back. A cloud rolls in, fast and dark. The crowd groans, sensing the shift. One moment you're squinting under the harsh Roman sun, next wind lashes the top rows like a whip. Someone's hat flies off. Another curses as dust pelts their face. And then comes the rain. Freak weather in the Colosseum was more than just an inconvenience, it was a hazard. The structure open to the skies had little protection beyond the partial awning known as the velarium. But that canvas canopy didn't cover everyone, and worse, it couldn't stand up to strong gusts or sudden storms. When the weather turned, so did the crowd's luck. Imagine being perched high in the upper tiers as the wind kicks up. Banners, those colorful streamers strung along the railings, tear loose and whip across faces. Wooden poles securing shade cloths start to shudder, nails moaning in their sockets. Some of them give way crashing onto the steps below like javelins of splintered pine. You duck instinctively as something small and sharp zips past your cheek. A bit of tile, a fragment of pottery. No one knows, but heads are now bowed not in reverence but in self-preservation. Historians note that Colosseum injuries weren't always caused by beasts or collapsing seats. Sudden weather shifts could transform the structure into a rain-slick trap. The stone became slippery, the stairs treacherous. There are records of spectators falling tumbling down rows of wet marble or being knocked over by flailing arms and flying debris. One poem describes a woman struck by a dislodged iron lantern, calling it an omen wrapped in thunder. Others mention impalements by falling flagstaffs, broken noses from flying fruit bowls, and the occasional chicken cage, yes, chickens blown from a vendor's stall and into the crowd. And yet, despite the hazards, the games usually continued. Rain was an inconvenience, not a showstopper. Gladiators fought soaked and steaming, their feet slipping in wet sand. The crowd endured pulling cloaks over their heads, trying to keep cheese and scrolls dry under crude umbrellas of papyrus or hope. There is scholarly disagreement about whether the Colosseum had an official weather protocol. Some believe that minor storms were ignored, while major ones, lightning strikes or high winds, could lead to pauses or evacuation. Others argue that, unless the emperor got wet, the games went on. No consensus has emerged, only scattered commentary and conflicting reports. You sit now hunched against the wind, your tunic sticking to your back, your sandals nearly sliding on the slick stone. A child beside you squeals as his lunch flies away. Somewhere a goat bleats in distress. The lion looks annoyed, Still the drums begin again. The gates creak open. Another pair of gladiators steps into the storm. And you grip the bench a little tighter, blink the rain from your eyes, and marvel at the sheer Roman absurdity of it all. A stadium of spectacle, yes, but also a stage for every kind of misfortune. Even the sky played along, what draws a person back to danger again and again. The lure of the arena was never just about blood or victory. It was something deeper, something stickier, more human. You might think it would be easy to stay away from a place where people regularly died for sport, but history whispers otherwise, and the whisper sounds suspiciously like cheering. You slide into your usual spot on the stone steps. The morning sun has barely crested the arches, but already the air is thick with sweat and fig wine. Around you, children wiggle impatiently, lovers flirt behind palms, and merchants hawk roasted dormice skewers. It smells like garlic iron and sandalwood oil. And just like that, the crowd begins to chant. The Romans were addicted. That's one explanation modern scholars propose. The thrill, the noise, the adrenaline. It wasn't just amusement, it was a physiological high. Like gamblers or cliff divers, some historians suggest the citizens of Rome grew chemically dependent on spectacle. Cortisol, dopamine, the rush of unpredictable violence, it all formed a cocktail of sensory overload. A kind of blood-fueled binge. Of course, researchers continue to debate whether this compulsion should be classified as addiction in the clinical sense or a form of extreme habituation born of cultural norms. Social pressure also played its part. Everyone went. Senators, slaves, scribes. The emperor showed his face, so how could a cobbler not? Failing to appear at a major set of games could be seen as political indifference or, worse, snobbery. To be absent was to invite suspicion, rumors, even mockery. So even those who feared the violence or felt uneasy still attended, caught in a web of expectation and spectacle. And honestly, who wants to be the one neighbor not talking about the lion that swallowed a flute player whole? Then there's the stranger theory. Maybe the risk itself was part of the charm. Gladiators could die. Spectators could too. There are documented instances of collapsing seats, lightning strikes mid-match, and in one bizarre case, a bear escaping into the stands and hugging a vendor to death. These weren't passive shows. They were immersive experiences where life and death blurred. Some scholars argue that Romans flirted with their own mortality by watching others face it. It was a kind of ritualized existential rehearsal. Still, this theory remains controversial. Some researchers dismiss it as retrospective romanticism, projecting modern psychology onto an ancient pastime. After all, not every spectator sat there meditating on the fragility of life. Sometimes they just like the snacks, and the noise, and the chance to root for a favorite. One wooden comb discovered in Pompeii was carved with a tiny detailed engraving of a gladiator's face. His name was Silatus, and someone, perhaps a teenage fan, had scratched underneath Silatus, the thrice victorious. The girls sigh for him. Ultimately, there's no single explanation. The arena beckoned for dozens of reasons: status, thrill, tradition, peer pressure, even habit. But whatever the cause, the result was always the same. The seats filled, the trumpets blew, and someone whispered, "Here they come." And if the arena was Rome's stage for violence, then the bathhouse was its backroom theater, steamier, slipperier, and just as charged. Not with swords, but with sandals, secrets, and the occasional flying elbow. You slip through a tiled archway into the bustling chaos of a Roman bathhouse, shoulder to shoulder, with senators, slaves, and fishmongers. It's the caldarium, the hot room thick with steam, and the murmur of dozens of conversations. Your bare feet press against slick stone, still warm from the coals beneath. The air smells like olive oil, sweat, and faint traces of sulfur. At first glance, it feels like any other public gathering, communal, civilized, even elegant. But you notice the scratches on the walls, the bruises on elbows, the way bathers eye one another, just a second too long. This isn't just a place for scrubbing backs, it's a theater of unspoken tensions. You reach for the brass railing only to find it scalding. A man nearby yelps softly and shakes his hand, pretending nothing happened. Roman baths weren't merely about hygiene. They were stages for social maneuvering, political gossip, and sometimes outright confrontation. While the wealthy boasted private attendants and even personal masseuses, poorer Romans jostled in the same pools, making accidents or excuses for aggression more common. And then there were the gang's rival factions of young men who would occasionally enter together and leave a trail of cracked tiles and cracked ribs behind. Some historians argue these skirmishes were spontaneous. Others suggest the bathhouses were intentionally used as battlefields, hidden from public view, yet echoing with the same violent rhythms of the arena. Quirky details abound. Roman sandals, for instance, sometimes had metal studs perfect for gripping wet floors, or someone's foot. In one preserved bathhouse, archaeologists found tiny bronze hooks, possibly used to hang garments, or perhaps to trip an enemy mid-stride. Even the soothing oil massages had their hazards. Drop your strigil, the curved metal scraper, and it could slice a toe clean. Scholars continue to debate. Just beyond the steamy baths, the taverns of ancient Rome buzzed with a different kind of energy, flickering lamplight, raucous laughter, and the sharp clatter of dice on wooden tables. You duck your head beneath a low lintel into the warm haze of wine and mischief. A server brushes past, balancing a bowl of lentils and a clay jug of sour red. Somewhere to your right, coins jingle. Then, unmistakably, the sudden slap of flesh on flesh, followed by silence and then a drunken cheer. Dice games in Rome weren't merely a pastime. They were a test of wit luck, and more often than not, restraint. The game of Alea, an ancestor of modern craps, was a tavern favorite. Players hurled knuckle bones or cubical dice onto the table, calling bets and praying to Fortuna, goddess of chance. But chance was never enough for some. Archaeologists have unearthed Roman dice pierced through with tiny metal pins far too deliberate to be damaged from use. Sabotage superstition. It's unclear. Some suggest these were weighted used to trick opponents. Others believe they were cursed talismans defaced to ward off cheating or ill fate. And yet, cheating was rampant. Patrons devised sleights of hand, loaded dice or coded gestures to con unsuspecting opponents. And when caught, well, you didn't always walk away with just a bruised ego. A poet of the time quipped that a smart gambler brought a friend not to play, but to stand guard with a cudgel. Roman taverns had no bouncers. Justice was local, spontaneous, and often fueled by wine. You lean against a pillar and observe a particularly heated match. One player, face red and shining, points to the dice as if they've betrayed him. The other shrugs, feigning innocence even as his hand hovers suspiciously near the pouch at his waist. A crowd forms. Tension builds. Then another blow. This time it lands square on a nose which crunches audibly. No guards arrive. No one intervenes. Instead, someone laughs. Another slams a mug on the table. Life goes on, blood and all. Despite their risks, dice games weren't outlawed outright. Roman law forbade gambling during most of the year, but conveniently allowed it during Saturnalia, the rowdy December festival, when rules bent and misrule reigned. Even children rolled dice during this time, sometimes with treats as stakes. But adults, they gambled for money, favors even slaves. And when tempers flared as they often did, the tavern floor bore the bruises. There's a peculiar charm in how much faith Romans placed in small cubes. No matter your status, a merchant, a soldier, even a senator, Fortuna's roll could make or break your night, or your nose. Historians still puzzle over the duality of these games, harmless diversion or dangerous vice. Were they mere entertainment or thinly veiled war by chance? Outside the tavern, now the evening air cools your cheeks. Behind you, laughter mingles with grunts of pain. Another round begins. The dice clatter again, sharp metallic, as if warning you risk is the game, and the game never sleeps. The evening quiet of an elite Roman villa hums with anticipation. Silver trays gleam under oil lamps, cushions are fluffed just so, and the scent of roasted fish mingles with pungent garum sauce. You trail behind a servant balancing a platter, your footsteps soft on mosaic floors. Tonight's dinner party, meant to impress, might also maim. A low laugh rolls from the triclinium, where 3 guests recline nibbling olives and tossing bones to the floor. But as you peer at the next course, unease stirs. A whole red mullet eyes still bulging lies center plate, cooked or not quite, and beside it, a mushroom plump glistening and suspiciously similar to a sketch you've seen labeled Death Cap. Elite Roman dining was more than indulgence. It was performance power play and occasionally a gamble with mortality. Some hosts flaunted their wealth by serving exotic or risky dishes, pufferfish that might still hold toxins, mushrooms prized for rarity, but nearly indistinguishable from their deadly twins. Recipes from Apicius, the famed Roman cookbook, warned about such dangers, advising tricks to test edibility. But in dim candlelight, after too many sips of spiced wine, who really followed the steps? One of the most bizarre cases involves fugu-like fish imported from the East. Roman chefs sometimes served them lightly prepared to demonstrate culinary mastery. Unfortunately, lightly often meant barely. A single slip in slicing could release neurotoxins. Several noble families recorded unexplained deaths following feasts. Some whispered poison, others blamed fish. But it wasn't always the host's fault. Guests themselves sometimes slipped poison into rivals' cups. Feasts could turn fatal, not because of bad cooking, but because of bitter politics. Roman senators wary of assassination sometimes traveled with their own food tasters. Imagine reclining, lifting a fig to your lips, then pausing as your taster turns pale and slumps beside you, appetite lost. Quirky relics from these dinners abound. One recovered spoon had a tiny notch for dripping antidotes into wine. Another, a plate inscribed with a grim pun, "Eat and let die." Whether the guests chuckled or winced is unclear. Some scholars argue these deaths were rare, exaggerated by dramatists and gossip. Others believe fatal feasts were far more common than official records admit. After all, Rome's elite had both motive and means to eliminate quietly. Food made a perfect disguise. You edge away from the table toward the atrium, where safer snacks await, perhaps some nuts dates or a modest bread roll. Behind you, laughter erupts as someone bites into a too-hot oyster, but your eye lingers on that mushroom, its gills too pale, its skin too smooth. Elsewhere in the villa, a musician begins to play, plucking a slow, eerie tune. The shadows stretch. Another course approaches. There's always room for dessert, but in Rome, dessert sometimes bit back. The air shifts again, still scented with wine and wax, but now carrying a sharper edge, ink sweat, and tension. You settle onto a low stone bench in a crowded portico, where poets prepare for war, not with swords, but with verses sharp enough to draw blood. It's a public poetry reading a recitatio, where aspiring writers share their work aloud, before a crowd of patrons' rivals and the perpetually unimpressed. The first poet clears his throat. A hush falls. He begins with an ode to springtime, but before the second stanza finishes, a sandal flies through the air and lands beside him with a dull thud. Roman literary culture was passionate and volatile. While salons and reading rooms conjure cozy images, today public recitations in ancient Rome could turn feral. Audiences often drunk or bored, heckled freely. Throwing vegetables was not unheard of. But occasionally it went further. Full-on, fistfights erupted when pride met poetry under flickering torchlight. You lean forward as another poet takes the stage, toga, slightly askew, scroll trembling. His lines satirize a powerful official's nose. A risky move. Laughter builds, then quickly fractures, as one listener lurches to his feet, red-faced and roaring. The crowd stirs. The poet fumbles, then flees. Was it insult or critique, art or slander? Rome wasn't always sure. A peculiar fact, some of the most controversial verses from this era were preserved not in books, but as graffiti scrawled across walls, taverns, and bathhouses. One scratch stanza reads, "He writes like a goat, bleats without pause or purpose." Another, barely legible, says simply, "Die Lucius." It's unclear whether Lucius was a rival poet, a landlord, or both. And yet, poetry was revered. A clever turn of phrase could win favor, sponsors, even a seat at the emperor's table. But step wrong, offend the wrong man or woman, and your verses might earn you exile, or worse, silence. Quirky rituals surrounded these readings. Some poets bribed audiences to cheer. Others hired stooges to laugh at just the right moment. One satirist allegedly paid a boy to faint dramatically during his performance just to stir sympathy. Historians disagree on how common these tactics were. Some claim they were theatrical embellishments. Others think they were essential survival strategies in the cutthroat world of Roman arts. You watch as the next poet steps up, older, calmer. He opens with a lament about lost love and aging teeth. This time the crowd listens. No sandals fly, no noses twitch, just murmurs and a few quiet sighs. As the sky darkens beyond the columns, the torches cast strange shadows across the floor. Verses rise and fall like tides, each line a fragile offering to the gods of taste. You wonder if any of these poets sleep peacefully after their performances, or if they too lie awake replaying every rhyme, fearing they missed a metaphor or a knife in the back. Sometimes in Rome, the pen wasn't just mightier than the sword, it invited the sword's swift reply. From crowded taverns to torchlit poetry battles, the noise of the Roman world lingers in your ears, but now it's replaced by an unsettling crackle. You've joined the crowd at one of Rome's seasonal festivals, and the scent of smoke wraps around your cloak like a warning. Ahead, a line of youths prepares to leap through open flame. It's part ritual, part dare. The fire leap performed during festivals like the Perilia and Lupercalia, believed to bring fertility, luck, or purification, depending on whom you ask. This fiery act was not just spectacle. It was participation. Citizens, especially the young and bold, would sprint barefoot toward the blaze, leap high, and hope for more than applause on the other side. Hope, that is, for no singed tunics or blistered feet. You find a spot beside a weathered column and watch a boy no older than 15 tighten the rope around his tunic. He nods to the rhythm of a drumbeat, then runs. His foot catches the edge of the pyre's stone ring. His sandal slips. The flame licks up his leg. There's a gasp from the crowd. He emerges limping, but laughing, his eyebrows half-scorched and triumphant. Scorch marks still visible on ancient pavement stones suggest these stunts often ended less cheerfully. Roman physicians recorded ointments specifically for festival burns involving goose fat and crushed laurel. Some healers even attributed lingering fevers to flame fever, a term modern scholars debate. Was it infection, heat stroke, or just old-fashioned superstition? Not everyone leapt for joy. In some accounts, participants were chosen at random or even pressured by peers. One mosaic fragment shows a youth being shoved from behind, wide-eyed in mid-leap. Did he volunteer, or was that part of the fun? Historians remain divided on whether these rites were strictly consensual, Records are vague, and the difference between bravery and coercion, as ever, blurs with time. Rituals often took place at dusk, just as shadows lengthened and the fire glowed brightest. Women threw herbs into the flames, rosemary, thyme, and sometimes scraps of old garments as offerings. Children chanted mimicking their elders. Street dogs barked. The mood was jubilant, but tinged with the thrill of danger. One slip could mean days of agony or permanent scars. A quirky tradition emerged from these events. Lovers would leap the flame together while holding hands. If they released mid-jump, the relationship was said to be doomed. Roman poets milked this image. Endlessly burned feet and broken hearts often appeared in the same verse. Whether the rhyme helped the healing is another matter. Some scholars think these rituals had roots in earlier Etruscan fire festivals. Others point to Celtic or Persian parallels, arguing Rome borrowed more than it invented. But the exact origins remain cloudy like smoke, rising into a twilit sky, always just out of reach. Another drumbeat, another leap. You squint into the heat haze, wondering if luck comes wrapped in fire. How many Romans went looking for it, and came away burned, just when you think you've left the chaos behind? Another spectacle beckons louder, wetter and far more perilous. You arrive at a stone arena not to watch chariots or gladiators, but ships. Real ships. In the middle of the city. And they're not just floating, they're fighting. Mock naval battles, or naumachii, were among Rome's most ambitious entertainments. Entire arenas or excavated basins were flooded with water, turning dry land into sudden seas. Spectators cheered as slaves or condemned prisoners reenacted famous sea battles, rowing hard under blazing sun while dressed in whatever costumes fit the storyline, sometimes Greek, sometimes Egyptian, sometimes purely imaginative, the fighting real, the splinters real, the drowning, also quite real. You find your seat among the crowd. A fan vendor walks past shouting prices. Below, two vessels circle each other, one painted red, the other black. The crowd cheers as they crash together, shields clashing and water flying. A man falls overboard. There's a moment of hesitation, then he's gone beneath the surface. While these mock battles thrilled the masses, they were logistical nightmares. Hundreds of workers labored for days to fill the arena. Some emperors, like Augustus, commissioned entire artificial lakes just for the occasion. Wooden ships, often full-sized, were built only to be destroyed, the expense immense, the purpose spectacle loyalty and imperial grandeur. But sometimes the danger spilled beyond the staged warfare. Wooden railings warped in the sun. Stone benches grew slick. One account tells of spectators leaning too far forward, only to tumble into the flooded arena. Panicked shouts, slippery marble, and chaos. No lifeguards, no nets. You either swam or sank. Inscriptions discovered near old arenas commemorate unnamed spectators who drowned during the games. Were these accidents or the result of drunken overreach? Historians debate this with some, suggesting these tragedies were more common than records admit. After all, it wouldn't do for an emperor's grand entertainment to be remembered for civilian casualties. Among the quirks, one emperor reportedly had fragrant oils poured into the water to sweeten the air for noble guests. Others released colored fish before battles, delighting the crowd with the shimmering chaos until the ships crushed them. One account even mentions crocodiles placed in holding pools for realism, though it's unclear if they ever made it onto the battlefield, or off again. And those in the boats, they rarely volunteered. Enslaved people, criminals, or prisoners of war made up most of the crews. Some couldn't swim. Others knew their best chance of survival was to act so poorly that they'd be spared for incompetence. A strange strategy, but occasionally effective. Still many met their end underwater, never to be named or remembered. A hush falls as another boat capsizes. The crowd rises eager to see the outcome. But from your spot in the stands, the splash echoes differently. It's not just part of the show. It's a reminder of how easily control slips beneath the surface. You lean back against the stone, careful not to sit too close to the edge. The splash of water fades into the sharp thwack of arrows striking wood. You've wandered into a training ground just outside the city walls, where Roman archers demonstrate their skill for an eager crowd. The target a straw mannequin, painted like a barbarian. The risk, well, everything else. You settle on a grassy knoll close enough to see the feathered shafts vibrate after impact. Close enough, too, to notice the unease among the spectators. Children sit cross-legged. Merchants clutch their cloaks. And archers. They grin just a little too much. One even takes a swig from a wineskin before knocking his next arrow. Public archery displays were intended to impress strength, precision, discipline. But Roman arrows weren't toy props. These were hardened tips, some barbed, others fire-hardened, and all more than capable of causing serious harm. Demonstrations often took place in open fields or public forums where boundaries were marked not with fences but with suggestion. Stand back carried more meaning when disobedience could result in a pierced thigh. And incidents did happen. One poorly aimed arrow in the forum nearly struck a magistrate's horse. Another lodged into a bakery wall, shattering amphorae and leaving the baker furious and flour-covered. Several old letters and grievances refer to wandering shafts and careless bowmen. Whether compensation was ever paid is unknown. Roman liability laws for such accidents were vague at best, unless, of course, someone important got hurt. One performer known in preserved graffiti as Sabinus the Spinner performed blindfolded shots while spinning on one leg. He was eventually banned after his trick ricocheted off a bronze shield and embedded itself into the shoe of a governor's wife. She was unharmed. The shoe, however, was ruined. Some scholars claim this event sparked minor reforms in public demonstration laws. Others believe it merely shifted the show to a less politically sensitive plaza. A curious tradition developed among archers. They carried tokens of their worst misfires, arrows bent, chipped, or blood-stained, strung on leather cords and worn as cautionary necklaces. These relics served not as shame, but pride. A whispered reminder that even masters erred, and sometimes dramatically. You scan the crowd and catch a tense moment. A stray dog darts across the field just as an arrow is loosed. The archer gasps. So do you. But the dog escapes unscathed tail high, and the arrow buries harmlessly in the dirt. Nervous laughter follows. Someone mutters a prayer to Apollo. There's an ongoing debate among historians were these accidents frequent enough to be cause for concern or rare enough to make headlines. When they occurred, records are sparse and often conflicting. What is certain is this Rome loved a good spectacle even when the line between showmanship and danger blurred. As the sun begins to set, the last arrow soars, graceful, glittering against the orange sky, then lands with a firm thunk. No screams this time, just applause. As twilight deepens, the rumble begins not from thunder, but from hooves. You follow the noise to the Circus Maximus Rome's massive chariot racing arena, where cheers shake the earth and danger gallops at full speed. The crowd sways like wheat in a storm. Somewhere beneath the roar, a trumpet sounds. You take a seat near the upper rows, safest from both dust and disaster. Below the track gleams with churned sand. 4 teams, red, white, blue, and green, line up at the starting gates. Charioteers grip their reins, tight, eyes narrowed. No helmets, no seatbelts, no rules that would impress a modern engineer. The gates fly open, the chariots lurch forward. Immediately one skids slightly too tight a turn. The wheel wobbles, a horse stumbles. For a breathless moment, it seems like disaster. But the driver steadies lashes flying, and the race thunders on. Chariot racing was Rome's obsession, and the Circus Maximus could hold over 140,000 spectators. It wasn't just sport, it was tribal. Fans pledged allegiance to color-coded teams, sometimes with the fervor of cults. Riots broke out after races. Children painted walls with team slogans. Some emperors even aligned with factions using the racetrack as a barometer for public favor. But safety. Not exactly a concern. Horses collided. Wheels shattered. Drivers called Orige often wrapped the reins around their waists for better control. If they fell, they might be dragged across the sand until they either broke free or broke entirely. A hooked knife tucked into their belts was sometimes the only hope of escape, provided they remained conscious. One mosaic shows a pileup, mid-race 3 chariots, splintered horses, tangled sand, soaked dark. Another depicts a triumphant driver lifting his whip, blood streaked across his tunic, not all of it his. Whether this was celebration or survival, we'll never know. Strangely, even spectators weren't safe. With no guardrails between track and audience, crashes often spilled into the crowd. Pliny the Elder wrote of a nobleman gored by a flailing hoof, though whether he survived remains unclear. Others tell of vendors' trampled children lost, and more than one senator limping home after a front-row view turned unexpectedly interactive. Modern engineers remain baffled by the lack of basic safety infrastructure. No buffers, no walls, just open enthusiasm and very fast wheels. Some scholars argue that this was intentional, that Rome's appetite for spectacle demanded proximity to peril. Others suggest that wooden railings once existed, but decayed unrecorded. Either way, the risks were very real. There were quirks, too. Some drivers trained from childhood, their names chanted like pop stars. Others, former slaves, became rich beyond imagining if they survived long enough. One famously retired at age 27, claiming over 1,000 wins. He also claimed 17 broken bones and one recurring dream, being chased by hooves. The race nears its end. The red team surges ahead. The crowd is on its feet. The finish line looms, and with it the chance for glory. Or another broken axle. You sit back, heart racing. Not from fear, but from the absurd thrill of it all. The sun slips lower, casting long shadows over a curious procession rumbling through the forum. You edge forward, drawn by the sounds, drums' trumpet blasts, and the unmistakable clatter of wooden cages. A parade, yes, but not of soldiers, of animals. Rome loved its beasts. Tigers from India, crocodiles from the Nile, bears from the Alps, even giraffes whose awkward grace puzzled and delighted the crowds. Today a massive elephant leads the way, painted with swirls of ochre and draped in embroidered cloth. Behind it, a collection of monkeys in miniature tunics shrieking at pigeons. Children point. Adults pretend not to flinch. These were venaciones, parades and spectacles involving exotic animals. Part celebration, part threat. Rome reminded itself and its enemies that it could conquer not just people, but nature itself. Wild beasts tamed, or so they claimed. But animals, as it turns out, didn't always care for Roman politics. You trail the procession through a side street where the crowd tightens and suddenly shouts erupt. The elephant spooked by a thrown fig or a too-close drumbeat rears. Its painted blanket slips. A fruit vendor dives into a barrel. The crowd scatters as the beast barrels into a market stall, sending apples and amphora flying. You glimpse a guard trying to wave a torch, only to be gently but firmly head-butted into a crate of garlic. Stories like this weren't rare. Records tell of leopards escaping during transport, monkeys climbing rooftops and pelting citizens with stolen figs, even a rhino that charged a statue and refused to back down for hours. These processions, while planned with pomp, rarely accounted for panic. What's astonishing is how little safety protocol seems to have existed. No barricades, few handlers. One inscription from a city near the Danube reads, "Let the gods protect us from another camel day." Scholars aren't sure what happened, but it clearly wasn't festive. A favorite anecdote among Roman satirists involves a parade crocodile who wandered off mid-procession and was later found basking in a senator's fountain. Another tale describes a giraffe ducking through a city gate and becoming wedged for hours, its long neck swaying above confused onlookers. Some believe these stories were exaggerated for humor. Others point to artistic depictions that show chaos rather than control. Still, these parades weren't just for laughs. They were political theater, the emperor's power on full display flanked by the beasts he'd conquered. Whether the animals agreed with this narrative was another matter entirely. The elephant, now calmer, resumes its slow-paced trunk, swaying like a curtain in the breeze. The crowd reassembles laughter, mixing with nervous glances. You follow from a safer distance, mindful of tusks and tail swipes. Somewhere ahead, a monkey has climbed onto a marble statue and refuses to come down. A child claps. A senator groans. Rome, as always, balances on the edge between splendor and absurdity. And its animals. They just keep marching. The scent of animals fades, replaced by the musk of sweat and old wood. You drift toward a makeshift stage built near the Forum, its backdrop painted with crude mountains, its actors mid-scene in what should be a farce. But something's off. A sword glints too brightly. The screams are unscripted. Street theater in Rome was nothing if not immersive. Plays unfolded in public squares, marketplaces, even taverns, with performers often relying on the goodwill or chaos of the crowd. Costumes were minimal props improvised and scripts often ad-libbed. But sometimes actors went beyond improvisation. Sometimes the lines blurred between performance and peril. You sit on a low stone wall watching as two actors duel on stage. One stumbles clutching his side, the other freezes. Was that in the script? The crowd murmurs. A woman laughs nervously. And then the curtain falls, not because the play is over, but because no one is sure what's real anymore. Roman theater valued emotion, spontaneity, and spectacle. But in the streets where no formal licenses existed, performers often pushed the envelope. Some shows featured real blood animal or otherwise. Others used functional weapons for authenticity. The line between art and violence thinned considerably when the budget was low and the crowd was eager. One popular genre was the mimus, a blend of slapstick satire and crude jokes. Actors mimicked public figures, mocked laws, and often incorporated audience members into the act, voluntarily or not. Records tell of a senator dragged on stage during a parody of his own speech. He laughed. Until the joke turned personal. A quirky tradition, some actors wore masks soaked in vinegar to trigger real tears. Others used crushed onion tucked beneath their eyelids. And at least one performer reportedly faked his own death so convincingly, the crowd began to disperse until he sneezed. Yet not all was fun. Injuries among street actors were common, from splintered planks to dislocated shoulders. Audience members weren't always passive either. If displeased, they could and did hurl food sandals or insults. One account describes an actor being chased from the square after mocking a local baker's accent. He escaped with bruises and a loaf of stolen rye. Scholars debate whether these street shows were officially sanctioned or tolerated out of apathy. Some argue they served as low-cost distractions for the poor. Others see them as grassroots critique Rome's version of satirical protest. The truth, as usual, is probably both. You shift as a new scene begins. A woman in a makeshift toga delivers a soliloquy, her voice surprisingly clear, her words, a blend of heartbreak humor and something else. a warning. The crowd listens hushed. Then suddenly a stagehand bursts through the curtain, slipping on spilled wine and knocking over a prop pillar. Laughter erupts. The moment breaks. But in that brief silence you heard it. That thread of rawness of risk. In Rome, even pretending could get you hurt. And some plays ended not with applause, but with bandages. From slapstick stages to smoky altars, your path winds toward a very different kind of performance, quieter, older, and marked in blood. The chants reach your ears before the crowd comes into view, low and rhythmic, like breath drawn through a cracked reed. Ahead, a line of devotees steps barefoot across a stretch of broken shells. You pause watching as a young man winces, then presses forward, his skin streaked with ash and saffron. Around him, others clutch knives, not hidden, not theatrical, but gleaming in the open sun. This is no play, this is a rite. Religious rituals in ancient Rome span the spectrum, solemn, celebratory, strange, and sometimes savage. Most citizens offered wine incense or the occasional goat, but certain sects, especially the more ecstatic or mystery-based cults, practiced rites of personal sacrifice. Not full-on martyrdom, but a theatrical kind of devotion involving bloodletting, flagellation, and self-piercing. You edge closer, careful not to interrupt. A priestess circles the group, her robes trimmed in copper coins that clink softly with each step. She carries a shallow dish of wine and a twig dipped in oil. Beside her, a boy kneels, arms outstretched, as another acolyte threads a thin reed through the skin of his shoulder, deliberately, almost gently. One of the most striking rituals belonged to the followers of Cybele, the so-called Magna Mater. Her priests, known as Gaeli, were famous or infamous for their ecstatic ceremonies involving drums dancing and sometimes acts of self-castration. Not all rites were so extreme, but blood was often seen as purifying a gift to the goddess and a symbol of transformation. Some traditions involved walking across fire-warmed tiles or crawling through thorn-laden trenches. Others used fragments of seashells, sharp, symbolic, and always painful. These weren't punishments, they were offerings. And while most Romans watched with a mix of awe and discomfort, a devoted few saw these acts as spiritual elevation. Quirky details surface in ancient texts. One rite required participants to whisper secrets to a carved statue before cutting themselves, as if the stone might absorb their sins. Another mentioned lemon juice poured over cuts, not for infection, but as proof of resolve. Modern scholars squirm. Some suggest exaggeration by outsiders. Others believe the Romans misrepresented foreign customs to paint them as barbaric. In truth, many of these rituals blended cultures. Imported gods brought imported practices. Some rites originated in Persia, others in Anatolia or Egypt. As Rome expanded, so did its spiritual palate, sometimes respectfully, sometimes hungrily. The result was a city of temples and thresholds, each with its own rhythm, its own rules. You step back as a new chant begins this one, quieter, more intimate. A woman weeps as she presses her palm to a smear of blood on the altar stone. Her fingers shake, then she smiles. Faith-like pain takes many forms. In Rome, it sometimes drew blood. But for the faithful, the cut wasn't the point. The devotion was. The chanting fades as you stroll past ivy-clad walls toward an unlikely sound, wooden swords clacking, followed by high-pitched laughter. You pause at an open courtyard where half a dozen Roman children circle one another, tunics flapping, sandals scuffing the dirt. Their weapons, not sticks, not toys. Their wooden gladii modeled after the real ones used in the arena. One child lunges dramatically, falling, as the winner raises his arms, mimicking the cheers of a Colosseum crowd. Another acts as referee, holding a scratch piece of slate with tally marks etched in chalk. This isn't just a game, it's rehearsal. In ancient Rome, imitation wasn't limited to art or oratory. Children mimicked what they saw around them: market haggling, funeral processions, temple offerings, and gladiators. The arena was a powerful presence in Roman culture, and its brutal pageantry trickled into the nursery. While parents warned against roughhousing, they also bought wooden helmets and child-sized shields, popular gifts at Saturnalia, and often personalized with painted animals or family emblems. One preserved fresco shows a curly-haired boy grinning his arm in a sling and a wooden sword at his feet. The caption crudely scratched beneath reads, "Felix the Brave. He bled only once." Whether it was affection or sarcasm is anyone's guess. You watch as a small girl, with a painted red stripe under each eye, circles her opponent. Her stance is practiced, almost elegant. Then whack her sword taps her friend's knee, and she beams. A chant rises. Victor, victor. Someone hands her a laurel crown made of olive twigs. While these mock battles were common, they weren't without consequence. Doctors of the era reported bruises, fractures, even concussions. One scroll warns of excessive imitation of arena sport, suggesting some parents tried, perhaps in vain, to limit the practice. But the culture of spectacle ran deep. Some fathers took pride in their children's martial flair, especially if they hoped for a future in the military or public life. There's a scholarly debate about whether these games were encouraged or merely tolerated. Some inscriptions suggest formalized training schools for youth, while others dismiss such claims as later embellishment. Still, the wooden swords remain discovered in dozens of ruins, often worn smooth by tiny hands. A peculiar twist, a few of these games evolve into semi-official contests held during festivals. Young boys would perform choreographed fights for crowds, complete with music commentary and occasional coin prizes. Satirists poked fun at these mini gladiators, calling them pint-sized pretenders. But the crowds came anyway. One tale tells of a child so talented in mimicry that a real gladiator invited him to train. The boy declined, reportedly saying, "I'd rather die pretending than pretend to die." Whether true or apocryphal, the phrase lingered. The courtyard now quiets. A mother appears calling her son home for supper. He drags his sword behind him, dusty and content. You smile, realizing in Rome, even childhood was edged with danger, but edged too with play. As the sun dips behind terracotta rooftops, you climb a narrow staircase spiraling toward a rooftop garden. Up here, away from the street bustle, all seems calm until a sudden buzz cuts the air. Then another. You duck instinctively just as a fat bee zips past your ear and lands on a ceramic pot brimming with lavender. Rooftop beekeeping was an oddly common Roman pastime. Amid temples and taverns, citizens cultivated mini apiaries above their homes, drawn by honey's sweetness, symbolic value, and practical uses. A single hive could yield enough wax for candles' balm, for wounds, and nectar for cakes. But with these golden benefits came winged risks. You tiptoe through the garden, careful not to disturb the dozen woven hives called alvearia, each balanced atop stacked tiles for ventilation. A young woman tends to one, humming softly as she lifts a clay lid. A puff of smoke curls from her censer, meant to calm the bees. It doesn't always work. Roman bees weren't bred for temperament. They were fierce, territorial, and easily provoked. One misstep could provoke a swarm, sending neighbors diving for cover, and lawsuits buzzing their way to the magistrate. Yes, Romans sued over bee stings. Legal texts from the period include bizarrely specific clauses about who bears responsibility when bees trespass, especially if they cross rooftops and sting unsuspecting bathers. One homeowner claimed damages after a swarm stung his servant during laundry duty. Another accused his neighbor of negligent honey handling. How these trials were judged remains fuzzy, but it's clear bee disputes could become civil wars in miniature. Despite the hazards, rooftop gardens thrived. Herbs like thyme, fennel, and marjoram attracted pollinators and masked city odors. Birds nested in clay pots. Vines crawled up chimneys. The entire cityscape seen from above was a living patchwork of green gold and the occasional flick of black and yellow wings. Quirky touches abounded. Some Romans tied tiny bells to hive entrances to train bees with sound. Others swore that reciting poetry calmed the swarm. A preserved inscription from a villa reads, "To the bees, gentle as verses fierce as Rome." Whether the bees agreed is uncertain. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how widespread urban beekeeping truly was. Some argue it flourished mainly in smaller towns and elite villas where space allowed safer distancing. Others insist the practice buzzed right through the heart of Rome, rooftops abuzz above bustling forums and bathhouses. You lean over the parapet watching a bee circle your elbow. It pauses, hovers, then darts toward a vine-covered pergola. Somewhere, a baker prepares honey cakes. A priest mixes wax into a ceremonial torch. A child reaches into a jar with sticky fingers. All from these rooftops, all from these bees, and still not a net in sight. In Rome, even leisure had sharp edges, and sometimes those edges had wings. The hum of bees fades as you descend into a shaded portico, where an elderly man crouches over a carved wooden board. He mutters to himself, brow furrowed as he slides a smooth tile across a grid. His opponent, a boy no older than 12, grins and slams down a piece with just a touch too much flair. You've stumbled upon a Roman board game in progress, and from the looks of it, things are getting tense. Romans adored tabletop games, from the strategy-heavy Ludus Latrunculorum to simpler race-style diversions like tabula game boards appeared in homes, taverns, and even carved into public steps. But these weren't always quiet pastimes. When the stakes rose, so did voices and occasionally fists. You watch as the boy knocks over one of the elder's pieces accidentally. The man growls. The next move is quicker, harsher, and the wooden tile slaps the board with audible disdain. A woman nearby rolls her eyes and discreetly moves her basket of figs further from the tension. Roman board games weren't limited to the idle or the elite. Soldiers played in camp. Workers on break gathered outside temples. Some boards were etched into stone walls, others painted onto folding planks. Dice pebbles or glass tokens stood in for pieces, and while some players bet only in jest, others played for coin drinks or more dangerous wagers, reputation revenge, even slaves in rare cases. Quirky evidence supports this edge. One excavated board bears deep gouges as if scratched during a tantrum. Another has notched corners, possibly for hiding coins beneath the game pieces. In Pompeii, graffiti reads, "Marcus cheats, and may his fingers rot." Friendly competition. Not always. Some games use tiles with metal or bone edges designed to clack pleasingly when placed. But such materials also served more dubious purposes. Sharpened corners became projectiles when tempers flared. One law from the early empire even mentions gaming implements used as weapons, suggesting the line between leisure and violence grew blurrier than the game rules themselves, and those rules not always agreed upon. While texts exist detailing gameplay, many seem contradictory. Scholars still puzzle over certain moves in Latrunculi, uncertain whether it was more like chess or checkers or something else entirely. Arguments over legality weren't rare during matches. You can almost hear a familiar phrase echo through the ages. "That's not how we played it in my neighborhood." The boy wins a round. He cheers too loud. The old man scowls, mutters about youth and luck, then demands another game. A coin is slapped onto the table. Now it's serious. You step back as more players arrive, each bringing their own tile-set rules and egos. The board becomes a battlefield, and the pieces soldiers in an unending war of wits and wounded pride. In a city where politics, poetry, and prayer all held potential peril. Is it any wonder that board games followed suit? You glance down and notice a tile at your feet. Smooth, cool, edged just enough to draw a line. Or a little blood. You've heard that silence is golden, but in some corners of the Roman Empire, it could also be suspicious. Especially during the height of imperial parades when the crowd's roar was more than celebration, it was survival. Rome loved a spectacle. Whether it was a victorious general returning from conquest or an emperor out for a leisurely promenade, these events were exercises in public adoration. But here's the catch, that adoration had to be loud, visible, and enthusiastic. A cheering voice was more than noise. It was a kind of political insurance. Now, imagine you toga, wrapped tight sandals dusty from the walk, finding yourself along the Via Sacra during one of these parades. Banners flutter above, incense clogs your nose, and golden chariots glint under the summer sun. On either side of you, thousands chant the emperor's name in perfect thunderous rhythm. But you, maybe your throat's dry, maybe you're just tired, maybe you're watching quietly, hands at your sides. That's a problem. To Roman officials stationed along the routes, a silent citizen wasn't just passive, they were potentially disloyal, especially under emperors like Domitian, who saw public acclaim as a litmus test of loyalty. Failure to shout, to wave, to smile in sync with the crowd could be interpreted as defiance, or worse, conspiracy. Some citizens learned to perform their excitement like a dance rehearsed, exaggerated, and always on cue. Lips moved even when throats were sore. Old women were known to slap their knees as if laughing uproariously, while children were instructed to cry with joy. Anything less than raucous could draw the wrong kind of attention. And what about those who dared to remain quiet on purpose? Historians still debate the story of a senator who allegedly refused to applaud a parade honoring Nero's mother. He wasn't seen again. Whether the tale is myth or truth, the message rang clear: be loud or be gone. A curious detail survives from a fragment of writing in a provincial town near modern-day Spain. It describes how civic leaders hired clappers, paid audience members to stand at regular intervals and stir the enthusiasm of the crowds. Think of them as ancient hype men, embedded to detect and correct any worrying silences. The practice wasn't limited to the capital. Cities from Antioch to Alexandria mimicked this model, particularly during imperial visits or festival games. Inscriptions urged the joyful citizenry to assemble and shout with strength, not exactly a spontaneous expression. Of course, not all scholars agree on how widespread this suspicion of silence really was. Some argue that these warnings were aimed more at political rivals than everyday folks. But even so, the atmosphere they describe feels pressurized, as if cheerfulness had been weaponized. You keep walking, weaving through the streets after the parade. Your voice is hoarse now, not from joy, but from safety. Around you, other faces beam too brightly. Behind every smile is a hint of calculation. And in this empire, even your silence speaks volumes. Now, let the echoes of the Roman crowd fade into the background. The glitter of triumphal arches softens in your memory, and the rhythmic chant of names dissolves into silence, the kind that no longer threatens, but soothes. You've wandered through an empire where volume meant virtue, where applause was armor, and where even stillness was suspect. But here in this quiet corner of time, there's no need to cheer, just rest. Imagine the dusty streets emptying, the torchlight flickering out, the last cloak swept from the forum's stones. Somewhere a flute player finishes a tune no one heard, and in the hush that follows, you exhale. History, for all its noise, has finally settled down. If this helped you rest tonight, drop your time plus city in the comments and tell me which forgotten character or tale you want next.